Good morning, North America. Welcome to Church Talk, lively conversation for all things church transformation. I'm your co-host, Dr. Bill Tenney Britton, in our studio in Columbia, Missouri, the heartland of the U.S. And I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, author and denominational leader, Dr. Chris Tenney Britton, the area minister of the Northeast area of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ of Mid-America. Try and say that 3 times fast. Good morning, Chris.
Well, good morning, and welcome to Church Talk Live.
Bill and Chris Tenney Britton here today to talk about how to build a culture of trust.
This is a big one for us, and we know for many of you, the distrust that runs rampant in congregations can be overwhelming. And I cannot tell you how many times over the past 15, 20 years, I've been in conversations with congregations where we hear things like those leaders and this one and that one and that pastor. And you realize that there is no trust there whatsoever, that people have taken out and have gone beyond account that those people are their friends, and that in most cases they put them into their leadership positions.
Well, here's how you can tell whether you have a trust issue, or at least one of the ways you can tell if you have a trust issue in your congregation, at least one that's been embedded and codified within your congregation, and that is if you have committees and boards that oversee and manage every detail, or at least most of the details, and oversee and manage all the opportunities for new and ongoing ministries.
Yes, so that would really mean that if you can't do anything without your board giving the thumbs up for it, let alone letting your board conceive it, if you can't do anything without write-off or sign-off by a number of people, or as you say, by a committee, but particularly by a board, then, or if you're a smaller congregation, by the congregation as a whole, you know you've got a trust issue.
Well, I think of congregations that, and I think of a particular ministry that a person came to the pastor in April and said, listen, I've got a great idea for a ministry. There is no one really working with the kids at the elementary school across the way that are on reduced and free lunches. And I think that the church, we should offer a ministry that would help cover some of that slack during the summertime. Well, the pastor says, hey, I think that's a good idea, but we need to talk to the board. So the next board meeting was the first part of May. This person went to the board, and the board discussed it after she presented it. And the board said, it's a really great idea, but it really needs to have oversight of the outreach committee. Could you meet with them and see what they say and see if you can coordinate with them and then get back with us? Well, the committee, the outreach committee met later in May, and so she got to see and have a conversation with them, and they thought it was a great idea. They were ready to put it into place. And so then they said, well, we got to get the financial people on board. Well, it turns out they didn't meet till the first week of June, so they went to the finance people in the first week of June, the committee, and the committee met and said, hey, that's a great idea. Let's send it forth to the board so they can get the final approval. And it was July before the ministry could take place. And here's the deal, is if this was going to be a successful ministry, they needed to begin advertising at the school back in April and May. And all of these things have been put into place because somewhere in the past, some leader had overstepped their bounds, or there was poor leadership decisions made, and a structure was put into place, or a new rule was put into place and said, that's not going to happen again.
I know that some of you are going to say, but we want everybody to be on board. We want the congregation to feel like they own this ministry. No, there's a trust issue going on there. Those are very noble reasons, but they're more immovable excuses.
Well, and they hinder ministry.
Right, that's exactly what I was going to say. You're not going to be able to do anything with ministry. Now,
right.
Go ahead.
We live in exponential times, and we need to be able to make decisions now, or at least not over a 2 or 3 month period.
Well, and with that though, because a lot of people say, well, that's, foolish, but it's not, because this is a whole nother episode. We could talk about permission giving ministries. And again, that's a whole other conversation, one we definitely need to have. But today we really want to talk about not having a culture of trust, but how we can build cultures of trust.
Exactly.
So,
And so the solution to the problem is, of course, to trust your leaders. And if you don't trust your leaders, hey, remove them, really. And I said this just this weekend at a congregation. I said, if you don't trust your pastor, then remove your pastor, fire her. And the pastor's eyes get about this big around. But the people like, yeah, if we don't trust our pastor, why would we leave this person in leadership? However, if you do trust your leaders, let them do their job. And for that to happen, you have to build a culture of trust. And we have 6 steps. Oh, you have more to say?
I do want to say, because I want to bring an example in here and say, any of you who've ever parented teenage children, you know that you have to give them opportunities. So whether you fully trust them or not, you still have to allow them to step out on their own, and then you come back. And so it's the same with this. If you've got new leaders in place, or you're not really sure, you still have to let them try, and you have to allow them to try and to give it their best shot. But if you keep hindering them, then they're going to run away from home, or they're going to step out. They will quit. And I'm sorry, that's not acceptable either. So okay, now we've got 6.
Well,
go ahead.
And when we get to step 4 in a few moments, we'll talk about what happens when a leader does fail. So it's not like you just say, here you go, have at it. So there's 6 steps that we have to help develop a culture of trust in your congregation, so that ministry and mission decisions can be made in a timely manner, and things can get done in your church in a timely manner. And the reality is if you do this, you'll end up having a lot less meetings. And I've never been in a church that said, gee, I wish we had more meetings. So here we go. Number 1, and this is the number 1. And by the way, these are in order. If you don't do them in this order, and especially if you skip number 1, everything else is pointless.
It doesn't matter.
That's right. So number 1 is you need to construct a firm spiritual foundation. That means, go ahead.
It really comes down to practicing the 2 great commandments. To build a spiritual foundation means that you as a congregation, or as many of you as possible, but really you as a congregation.
And the leadership is particularly.
Love God with the whole of your very being and love your neighbors. Now, you and I have been having a lot of conversation about this lately, because I believe that the way we have to share and teach these great commandments for today is that we have to make it 3-part commandments. That's why I just talk in terms of the great commandments. Love God with the whole of your very being, love your neighbors and yourself. Problem has, it's supposed to be love your neighbors as yourself, but a lot of us have no clue about loving ourselves. And honestly, in trust, I really believe, I don't believe, I know that that's where a lot of that trust breaks down. That people who don't trust themselves, people who become very just, this is the way it has to be for themselves, often will go ahead and put that onto other people. So these spiritual foundations really have to be grounded in good, healthy people. I heard someone say this weekend, we have to be adults when it comes to these, to leadership. And so building trust really is about being an adult.
Well, and that's very true. But to build this kind of spiritual foundation takes intentionality by the congregation and by the leaders themselves. We live in a culture that Christianity has been, and religion has been, a private practice. Don't mess with me. But here's the deal, folks, is Christianity is not a solo journey. Christianity is a team effort. It takes multiple folks. And the way to build a spiritual foundation in your leaders, one of the key ways isn't to say, do more Sunday school or do more small groups or do more worship services, but to ask the discipleship development questions, and you can get those on BillTenneyBritton.com. And we've got to do an episode on the discipleship development questions. But the bottom line is you're asking 5 key questions on a regular basis, and they're answering them. And the questions are, what have you read in Scripture this week that has intrigued you? It gets people talking about and reading Scripture. What have you heard from God in your quiet time, and what are you going to do about it? Who have you encouraged in the faith this week? In other words, who in your congregation have you called and said, hey, how can I pray for you and whatnot? Fourth, whose life is different because of your actions as a disciple of Jesus Christ? In other words, how are you doing service for others? And 5 is, how have you shared your faith this week and what was the results? You know, if those kind of questions are being answered and being asked and answered on a weekly basis, on a regular basis, you will see behaviors change and you will build a spiritual foundation among your leaders. And when that happens, then you have a foundation on which to build. If your leaders aren't practicing spiritual disciplines, there's nothing to build on besides the past traditions that they were raised in. And although that's nice, that doesn't take you into the future.
Well, there's clearly a difference. I think I said this last week. There's clearly a difference between secular leadership and Christian leadership. Right. And what we need in the church are Christian and really disciple leaders. And so that means they've got to be engaging in discipleship. And so there it is. And those discipleship development questions, and that also builds in an informal accountability, not a I'm going to smush you under my finger or shake my finger at you accountability, but where we put up an expectation, we set an expectation that you're going to be doing this.
We're encouraging people to take the next step.
It's also equipping them, right?
Exactly.
And empowering. Okay.
All right, so that's number 1. And if you're going to skip any step, skip all the rest of them, because this is the step for building trust. Is when your leaders are practicing the spiritual disciplines, trust can be built. Number 2, though, is if you're going to have trust within your congregation, then everyone has to be on board. At least the congregation and all the congregation leaders have to be on board by developing a shared and implemented DNA. And what we mean by DNA, we mean mission, vision, and values in particular. Those are the 3 we're going to talk about in this section. We'll talk about the others in a moment. But those are the 3, the DNA. And it's not just that we've run through a process that got these things on paper. A lot of congregations do that, and they have this shared DNA. But it really hasn't been implemented. You must implement this DNA.
I mean, DNA is implemented. DNA is embodied in us. It's deep down
well, it's meant to be.
It's not DNA if it's not, with all due respect.
Right,
if you've got
theories
something
on a paper.
Yeah, you've got something on paper, exactly. Maybe it's a hypothesis, but it's not DNA.
Right.
It's not been embedded yet. So, I mean, you got to be clear about what your mission is, and everything you do as a congregation organizes around that mission. And that then says, well, if you want it, this is, part of the permission giving stuff. Well, you want to do this, or so-and-so wants to do this. The question is, how does that further or fulfill our mission and fit into that? If not, then it's probably best somewhere else.
Well, and I think of the example of the Pepsi Corporation years ago when, their primary mission was creating beverages and et cetera. And someone said, hey, let's open or adopt or buy 3 restaurant chains. And they began losing to the other soda drink companies because they were so involved in these food businesses that were not their DNA. And they were able to, once they shed themselves of the restaurant businesses, they were able to come back to beverage and they were able to regain some of the lost ground. But if you veer from your mission or do things that aren't missional, it hurts your congregation and it hurts the trust because, what's going on. The other thing you have to have is you have to have inviolable values that are not just, and we do this all the time, we say, well, what's important to this congregation? Well, evangelism is important, and well, that's nice if we think evangelism is important. The question is, are you putting that into practice? If you say it's a value, that means you're actually doing it and putting money into it. So what are the inviolable values in our congregation? The last one that we started in Seattle, the number 1 core value was radical hospitality, which we embodied by saying, we smile with teeth, none of this. We really were genuinely welcome. And if you violated that value in leadership, you were removed from leadership. And that could be painful, but that's just how it was.
Well, when people weren't hospitable, it gave us the opportunity to have conversation with them in loving and gentle ways about what was going on that they weren't being able to be so hospitable there. The third piece in your DNA is a compelling vision. Compelling. It really propels you forward. And one of those that is sticking in my mind is a friend of ours who was pastoring in a town of 10,000, and their compelling vision for a while was we're going to reach 10% of our community. And so there it was right out there. And that church, their worship services began to grow and grow and grow as people were saying, on any given weekend evening or weekend, there's at least 10%. There's much more than 10% of our folks who are in no way having a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And so we want to be able to reach and to inspire 10% of our community.
Well, and here's the kicker, is they reached that goal.
Yeah, exactly.
They reached that goal and had to revision which is, by the way, vision does change.
Right.
It continues to move. Mission doesn't change. Values don't change. But vision marches you forward and helps you to continue the journey. And they actually reached 10% of their community and began moving on.
All right.
So a compelling vision. If everyone in your leadership is sharing this mission and the commitment to mission, and they're exhibiting these values, and they're all compelled to follow this vision, then the next piece really is pretty easy, and that is to adopt codified, in other words, they're actually written down and agreed upon, behavior covenants.
Yeah.
This is how we will behave towards one another and towards others, as the case may be, but specifically about with one another, those of us in the church, in all sorts of circumstances, and you need to write 2 of them.
Right.
And the first one is for your members. It's expected behaviors, and these are the basics, and we've done episodes on this, and you can check it out there. But, it's about, this is how I'm going to behave to other members of the congregation and those who come into the congregation who may not be members yet. You don't expect non-members to act this way, but we expect our members to act this way.
Well, I know you've done a lot of work with this, and I want to toss out, do a little commercial here, that the Flip Your Church workbook has, I believe it is
Right.
the first chapter, works specifically around that membership piece and getting your behaviors agreed upon, and in a consensual, that doesn't sound really good, but in a consensus-oriented way that can and is owned by the whole congregation.
Right.
And in my book, we start with this. I know that we've got them ordered, and definitely you can't get to this without a spiritual foundation and without, without a sense of where, who you are and where you're going. But it is so important, and by using processes and bringing people along, it can't help but develop that trust and a trusting culture.
Right. One more resource is that we've developed the conflict CPR DVDs that walk you through the process
Right.
of putting together your expected behaviors. There's a second piece though of codified behavior covenants, and that is a leadership
Right.
covenant. This is what we will do as leaders, and that leadership covenant is incredibly important because it walks you through, and since leaders should be held to a higher standard, that's true biblically and even in business. In general, your leaders are held to a higher standard of behavior. They should be. This is how our leaders will act. For instance, if you're a leader, then you're making an agreement, if whatever position you've taken, that you will attend, if there's integrity here, you will attend the meetings that your leadership responsibility calls you to. So no more of this, well, I'll be your leader, or I'll be a leader, but I'm not going to go to the committee meetings. If you can't go to the committee meetings, then don't be a leader. That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a whole bunch of there's a number of other leadership covenants that need to be in there. And again, we've done sessions on that as well.
Sure. Well, I want to say that if clause is a huge piece. So when you're doing, if your congregation calls for nominations or however you do leadership selection, if you have a leader who in replying yes or maybe says, well, if, or as long as, if you need to think seriously about, but there are times I need to put in the little piece because I was actually recently asked to be on a board, and I said yes, but you need to know that I'm not available on that one board meeting date. Is that okay? So there's a caveat, but if people start throwing up those if and as long as with a sense of haughtiness with them, we need to set that aside. And I want to come back to that word adult, that leaders need to be adults. That maybe that's part of a basic piece of the leader covenant, that in being adult, it means that you do not engage in childish banter, that you don't engage in gossip, that you that you don't engage. I'm trying to think how to put these positively.
well,
You don't engage in that factioning and making things even worse. You are an adult, and when it comes, when you're adult. When we've got 5 children between us, and if you walk into, or we walked, they're adults now, but when we'd walk into the room, and if they were doing knockdown drag out, we didn't get in there and knock down drag out with them and didn't take up sides. We were there to try and bring some peace, or at least to break them up. That's what being an adult is. That's what being a leader's about.
All right. Step 4.
Woohoo!
Implement proactive accountability. Now, remember I talked earlier in the hour that what happens when the leader gets out of line or whatever. Normally the church makes a rule, so it'll never happen again. And the problem with that kind of universality and throwing up those kind of roadblocks and so on is that it continues to restrict what a leader can do and what a leader should do. And so you implement proactive accountability so that when there's an issue, you hold the person, the leader, the member, whoever, accountable for their behavior. And since you have behavioral covenants and leadership covenants, then you have, if you will, an agreement already as a congregation and as leaders is this is how we'll behave, this is what we'll do. And if they step out of line, and people do intentionally sometimes, but sometimes unintentionally, they weren't really tracking their budgets and they end up spending $25, $50, hey, sometimes a lot of money over their budget. What are you going to do? Do you make a rule that says from now on, so that it'll never happen again, you can't spend any money unless da-da-da? Well, that just makes it difficult to do ministry. You'll hold that leader responsible, and if you need to remove them from leadership, then you do. If it was an honest mistake, you work with them and help them work through so that that mistake doesn't happen again. Again, if you can't trust them, remove them. Or if they need to be trained, retrain them.
Well, yeah, and I think that's kind of what you're saying is that you have a plan that when that leadership covenant is broken, that you know how you're going to step through it. It's easy to say, well, hey, if they break the leadership covenant, they're going to be removed from leadership. But it may be that they were having a really horrendous day, and somebody purposely pushed all their buttons and they zonked out. And we know situations where a leader has called and said, oh my gosh, I just really screwed up. This happened, and the question will be, so what are you supposed to do about it? And they'll say, I need to do this, this, and that. They know what they need to do. They just needed the encouragement to do that, and you would never remove them unless, of course, they were saying, well, I'm not doing anything about it, blah, blah, blah. And then there's
or
no
in case there's a
there.
pattern of behavior,
Right.
that they keep having bad days and whatnot.
They may need to
that's right.
step aside, right?
The other thing that really needs to be put into place is that with your behavior covenants, both for membership and leadership, but particularly for membership, if you walk through our processes that we've helped set up, is that you need to intentionally designate the parts of, if you will, Jesus' reconciliation plan found in Matthew 18, 15 to 17, so that if someone is so out of line that you have to confront them, that you have the systems in place to do that in a Christ-like manner, but also in a manner that protects the church, protects the integrity of your covenants, of your values, and of your mission, so that the church can move forward safely. And those who have seen the failure happen, whether it's a moral failure, an ethical failure, or just a dumb mistake that got made several times or whatever, that the congregation knows the issue has been taken care of, or is confident that the issue is being taken care of if it's behind closed doors, which sometimes it needs to be, in fact, often needs to be, but the congregation is confident that it's being dealt with. Therefore, the trust level goes up because they know that if a leader screws up intentionally or unintentionally, they're held accountable and it's made right somehow.
Well, there are 3 points I want to make here. One is around that leadership covenant. That leadership covenant is not 20, 50 rules or anything like that.
Right.
These are covenants. These are commitments that leaders are willing to take. But just as Moses had 10 commandments when he came down off the mountain, and within a generation after that, there were literally hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of rules and laws that nobody could do.
365, thou shalt not.
Yes. So, nobody could keep up with that. That's not what we're talking about. We're not even talking about 10, okay? And we're not talking about commandments. We're talking about agreements, about covenants, that people are willing, commitments that people are willing to take on. A second piece, and that's in this, fourth point that we're making here about implementing a proactive accountability plan. The key word in that is implement, that it needs to be implemented. It is not enough to have the covenants if you do not have the follow-up to go with that. So you've got to have not just only the plan, but you've got to know who's going to implement it, and not just one person, but a small group of people who hold each other accountable. Because when we see those covenants break down, it's because the implementation and the follow-through is not being taken care of.
Yeah, we're both aware of churches that have adopted leadership covenants and membership covenants, and they won't hold anyone accountable. Therefore, it's just on paper.
Well, and it's worse now than
right,
it ever
exactly,
was.
Right.
Okay.
All right.
So we got to go.
Okay. Number 5. Okay. When you nominate and select leaders, you nominate or select them solely on these parts. Number 1, that there is a continual and an intentional spiritual development. These people are working on their spiritual development, and it is clear that they are. They are exhibiting faithful behavior. Number 2, they have internalized the DNA. They live, breathe, of the church, right? They live and breathe the mission, the vision, the values. They understand it. They've been immersed in it, and they support it. They're loyal to it.
Yes.
They also have demonstrated behaviors that reflect your behavior covenant, and if they've been a leader before, their leadership covenant. They have exemplified who the congregation is. And finally, there is the passion. They have a passion for the position that they are being asked to do. They really want to invest and do whatever it is that you're calling them to do. If they just are a willing body, move on, find someone else, because if you find where their passion is and put them in it, they'll work there forever.
Yeah.
Finally, number 6, dealing with leaders who are already in place who need to rotate off.
So you rotate them off. A lot of churches use committee systems where you've got, again, this rotating piece where you come on for 3 years, and every year,
the class system.
That's it. Yeah, class system. And so every year, 1/3 or maybe 1/4 is going to rotate off. If you've got that, you can change your system in 3 years.
Right.
And yeah, and again, so many pastors and congregational leaders will say, "Oh, but no way, just think about it," and it may be that you have to start with your nominating committee and how you do nominations. If you're going to get the rest of it changed around, you probably are likely going to have to stay with that kind of committee who taps heads. We need to go, but I want to recap just these 6 pieces. So to build a culture of trust, you've got 6 pieces. 1.
Construct a spiritual foundation.
2.
Develop shared and implemented DNA.
3.
Adopt a codified behavioral covenant for both leaders and members.
4.
Implement a proactive accountability system.
Implement. 5.
Right, thank you. Nominate and select leaders based on the criteria we offered.
And 6.
Remove the leaders in some way who do not exemplify those, all of the above, all the above. Hey, go ahead.
More on the handout, complete with questions for your leadership team.
And we'll see you next week.
Have a great week.